start. Welcome everyone to this morning's panel. We're excited to have really three amazing presentations this morning. Under the title, Teacher, Don't Teach Me Nonsense. You reminded Fala's song. So we've got three presentations today. The person who's not presenting, who's not with us, is Rita. Our first presentation is Efua, Prah, and Terri, Maggott, talking to the role of feminism in the transformation agenda for institutions of higher learning in South Africa.
Thanks. I want to apologize that Terri Maggott isn't here today. She wasn't able, which is actually a result of the neoliberal university. She wasn't able to get grants from her department to come down here, which is why she's absent. But she is definitely with me right now, and she's written into the paper. So some of what she wanted to say is in this paper. So I'll just jump straight in. The title speaks for itself, which is also how we are taught to write titles in the social science, is to be really deontological about it. So it's about higher learning institutions and the role of feminisms in that. So in South Africa's recent call for a workable transformational agenda at HLIs, what we are arguing is that it's very important for us to carefully look at the carryover of patriarchal structures and the carryover of patriarchal ideology so that we can avoid the replication of these kinds of practices. In attending to a truly transformational and decolonial agenda, and we use the word transformational and decoloniality in exchange with each other. So sometimes you talk about transformation and sometimes you talk about decoloniality because the two of them feed into each other. And so in attending to this, we have to foster an understanding of the relationship between patriarchy, capitalism, and the colonial project. And so the extension of capitalism that we seek to interrogate in this paper is the presentation of the neoliberal university. And also the epistemic entanglements that arise from this relationship. So what we're not focusing on today, which I think we're all pretty much familiar with, is the different expressions of feminisms. But I will say that the different expressions that we look at are liberal, Marxist, radical, socialist, and then also African feminisms. But the wider paper will be published quite soon, and so if you are interested in how the minute details of how we unpack how the different feminisms work, then it's available. So there's two discursive points, and the first one is tracking the relationship between patriarchy, capitalist-driven universities, and the colonial project. So patriarchy reconfigures itself in historical progressions as a system consisting of various interlocking patterns of oppression and exploitation. And in her work, historian and feminist thinker Gerda Lerner, she maps out the historical development of patriarchy, and what she shows is that patriarchy happened rhizomatically along multiple paths through which society progressed into larger settled citadels. So unlike colonialism, patriarchy was not systematically planned, rather it manifested in slow processes of layered male-dominated exchanges. And so early evidence of settled communities reference more egalitarian systems of organization, but it's also been shown through the historical record that this shifted during the development of widespread agricultural communities between 10,000 and 3,500 BC that created more hierarchical practices. And so of course one of the hallmark features of the patriarchy is hierarchical organizing of society. And so crucial to this cataclysmic development was the creation of women as producers of expendable capital, not only through their labor, but also through their potential to birth new bodies for that labor. And so those new bodies would in turn add to their cumulative capital of agricultural produce and inheritance, which is of course structured very particularly along paternal lines with isolated incidents of maternal lines of inheritance and descent. So therefore, the controlling of women's production and reproduction became central to the reification of patriarchal practices and ideology. So Lerner's work also pinpoints the establishment of slavery as a crucial development in history, because it marked a significant turning point in the relationship between the dominant and subordinate groups. It institutionalized discriminatory practices that categorized one people as commodities to be traded, bought and sold. And the commodification of people arrived with its concomitant sets of oppressions and processes where all sorts of acts of dignity and honor were stripped, particularly for women. And these include legal codes that define women in reference to men, so through a specific marriage relationships. So as a woman, you were never recognized unless you were in reference to your husband. And then also class structures that separated women along socioeconomic lines. And so women were separated depending on whether they were married to nobility or whether they were laborers on the farms. And so there was no longer a space where multiple socioeconomic groups could interact fluidly and easily with each other. And then this was, of course, the separation of women was along their sexual status as well, in relation to marriage. So as a married woman, you were sanctified by that marriage as a whole sexual being. And if you were a mistress or a slave of a man, then of course your sexual wholeness starts becoming fragmented. So additionally, the exclusion of women from the public sphere and relegating them into the private sphere served to eliminate them from visibility altogether. And then I just also want to touch on the positionality of African women in history and to very loudly acknowledge that patriarchy existed way before colonialism. So regarding the positionality of African women in history, it has been covered by a score of scholars. It's not that there's no paucity of looking at African women's role in our collective history. And it's safe to conclude based on that in societies predating the advent of colonialism, women figured as subordinate citizens within communities. The relationship between African patriarchy and European-led capitalist expansion was figured along tenuous lines of mutual recognition, where the profits of exploitation and subjugation were seen as mutually beneficial to male-dominated practices. And this mutuality of capitalist prowess and patriarchy, it created fertile ground for the success of the colonial project. So without patriarchy and without the intention to exploit labor, the colonial project really wouldn't have been as successful as it was. And prior to capitalism, patriarchal practices and systems were fixed into private and public domains of sociality. And April Gordon argues that the socioeconomic architecture of patriarchy in pre-colonial Africa centered on the promotion of male-dominated societies. And although women were afforded marginal rights to land, wielded influence and status in their communities, and on occasion held political clout or political office in the decision-making processes, it was always, their positionality was always negligible, and men were the primary benefactors of a social, cultural, economic system that served to silence women's experiences of subordination and oppression. So the advent of colonialism marked another hallmark in patriarchal practice and thinking. And what was worse and emblematic of toxic patriarchal masculinity was when justifications were created via mythical arguments of biological superiority over the subordinate group, and where power and epistemic domination were used to threaten, control, and coerce opposition to the dominant patriarchal ideology. So the division of labor along racial and gendered lines further produced and entrenched ideologies of oppression that heralded white male superiority as the pillar of civilized growth and development. So these beliefs, created through patriarchy, were the mechanisms of the colonial project. And through the colonial project, the inequalities born from race, class, and gender discrimination intersected ontologically with the practice of patriarchy. So what began as the larger imperial project of expansionism and capital accumulation through land appropriation eventually fed into the colonial project, where male supremacy became an anchor of capitalist accumulation. So the aggression, particularly for Africa, well, not particularly, in this instance for Africa, the aggression of colonialism on already well-established African patriarchal systems further legitimated men's demands of women's subservience. And in effect, colonialism gave wider credence to African male-dominated ideologies, and in fact built modified and reified practices of patriarchy that remained in the post-independence nation-states. So whilst the colonial project was an entirely exploitative endeavor, serving only the interests of white supremacy, African women, this is also a plug for African women did to some degree figure as historical agential subjects, defining and reproducing their own identities against a broken background of colonial oppression and patriarchal suppression. And these histories are often obscured, so whilst they're there and written about, they're often obscured and emerge only in reference to overt arguments that foreground women as central to the thesis being put forward. So this once again highlights the ubiquity of dominant male-centered thinking and representation. That even in our mapping of historical processes, women's experiences are lived as addendums to the male experience. So African women were never silent victims to the blows of colonialism and the persistence of repressive patriarchy. Certainly, the record shows that African women contested individually and collectively in private and public domains. So regardless, the end of colonial rule, regardless of this effort, the end of colonial rule on the African continent, even though won in parts by women's work, did not materialize into the healing of a growing or metastasizing toxic patriarchy. And so the definitive moment of liberation then becomes about freeing the nexus between toxic patriarchy and gender-based oppression, removing the propensity to situate society as an extension of maleness destabilizes some of the repressive moorings of patriarchal thinking and practice. Inasmuch as the structuring and the reproduction of exploitative patriarchy happens slowly and markedly, the shift to dismantle unequal modes of interaction needs to happen in multiple ways, in multiple sites, spread over time and through the collective work of citizens, feminists, activists, researchers, writers, performers, politicians, gardeners, climate change activists, directly involving themselves in the work developed through the Black feminist tradition. And so here I just want to insert how the institutions of higher learning, which is the direct product of patriarchy, a direct product of capitalism, is to discuss how the designing of the neoliberal university and its emphasis on labor and productivity, and how this represents a capitalist paradigm with a white supremacist agenda. So Slaughter and Rhodes wrote an article in 2000, and they discussed the current capitalist ventures in the production of knowledge, or what's sometimes called the knowledge economy. And they talk about two metaphors, and the first they mention is academic capitalism. And this sees students as captured captured revenue sources and products of labor, which speak to the move towards the marketplace. And the second metaphor is, they call it managed professionals, which is giving recognition to an increased managerial control of faculty. And so what happens is that university management likes in the literature to refer to students as their customers, except that's not actually what's happening. The real customers are the big businesses that employ the products of the university, who are the students and, of course, faculty, staff members. And so there's a vested interest in producing more professionals and more vocationally based degrees that yield future labor exploits. So so there's a turning away from the liberal arts, there's a turning away from investing in the liberal arts, and there's more of an emphasis on building technocrats, bureaucrats, and money crunchers, or economic figure crunchers, that work towards the capitalist ideal of maximum profit, and also creating minds that think of maximum profit at lowest labor, at the lowest cost of labor. And if you look at the history of labor, that of course means that black bodies and black people are going to be exploited quite considerably. So there's less emphasis on the building bodies of work that shift ideologies, which is necessarily the work of the social sciences, is to think of those ontological questions, to think about the ideological representations of why we know what we know and how we produce knowledge. So if you're kind of creating more attention on vocational-based degrees, you don't have time to sit and think about the philosophical underpinnings of why we are where we are. And so at the end of that, the way forward. What could we do? So in the paper, we show that it's both epistemologically and historically, the scales have never been balanced. What began as a scientific endeavor to create order and sense in a world assumed to be innately wild is perhaps the cursory moment in history where patriarchal thinking became the epistemic referent. So here I'm referring to the Thomas Hobbesian idea of trying to create order, and that we are somehow ungainly and unwieldy when we're in touch with our wilderness, we're in touch with our wild. So you're trying to organize and categorize and create a taxonomy of experiences, which is very much part of the patriarchal ideal. And then it's also merged here with this Cartesian reliance on creating jewels in the ways that we think. So these different binaries, and within that duality and within that binary, there's a hierarchy. And when we're talking about hierarchy and we're talking about civilizing and making sure that we're curtailing the wilderness that is us, we are necessarily giving power to patriarchal thinking, or giving power to toxic masculinities, toxic femininities. And so HLIs can learn from feminist theory, because feminist theory is necessarily a deconstructive theory, in all its variations, to transform the institutional cultures of coloniality and neoliberal practices. So for example, very briefly, you have liberal feminism that can be used, and this is, please indulge me, I'm just whizzing through it. Liberal feminism can be used to frame policy changes in hiring and salary remuneration practices at HLIs. So Marxist feminism can be used to frame policy debates on the impact of neoliberal capitalisms on knowledge production. And African feminisms can be applied to social research in emphasizing contextuality and reflexivity in post-colonial knowledge production, and to dismantling white supremacist, anti-black, cisgender, able-bodied old boys club that continues to constitute the post-94 South African climate. And so for a real break from our colonial past to occur, we must check patriarchy at every chance that we get. We must understand it, and we must unpack it for what it is. And the way in which we can do this is using African feminisms Black African feminisms, is to center the lived and day-to-day experiences of Black and queer women, with an X, both at the level of policy and day-to-day interactions between HLIs and other staff. There's a need for further research that is Black-led, research which will be instrumental to implementing a program of radical change at HLIs in terms of race, gender, and other institutional repressions. And so when we critique the narrow heteronormative structures of social organizing, in effect we're operationalizing aspects of feminist discourse. But what we also want is not to just talk about the discourse. We want to actually operationalize it somehow. What we're asking for is to move towards a social transformation practice that seeks to problematize the layered nature of oppressions in the post-colony. So in saying all of that and in closing, the challenge, however, of which I'm still grappling with, and I hope we can have it as part of the discussion, is that in creating a truly transformational agenda that has at the onset the idea that we want to dismantle colonial patriarchal thinking, we have to acknowledge that the very structures that we seek to deconstruct are the same ones that that activists of yesteryear have used, at times successfully, to aggravate the status quo. And in various versions of social deconstructing and rebuilding, this was necessary. However, if we are to move beyond the myopic and narrow patriarchal parameters of what we envision change to be, we need to foster a creative, critical consciousness that has at the starting point the premise that the master's tools will never be able to dismantle the master's house. So that's the provocation, is then what tools are we using if everything that we are given to dismantle are actually the tools that built the master's house. So, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Addisalem, Yallew, and on the topic addressing gender disparities in Ethiopian higher education, the policy analysis.
Thank you very much. First of all, I kind of would like to say that my presentation considering I've been attending the sessions of the conference, it doesn't have the theoretical nuance that has been, that I've noticed, and I kind of realized that how my analysis would have been enriched if I had access to the literature, to the works of the people and the people themselves that I saw doing extraordinary theoretical analysis. Anyways, I'm going to start my presentation. First of all, I come from higher education studies, the tradition of higher education studies. I am a PhD student at the University of the Western Cape. This is not my PhD work, but this is looking into higher education from a gendered perspective is something that I would like to pursue in the future, perhaps from an interdisciplinary perspective, perhaps even cross-institutional or cross-national analysis from that perspective as well. So this is the topic, and then here is the outline of my presentation. So I will say something about Ethiopian higher education, in case you are not familiar with it. I will discuss the questions that I would discuss in this paper or presentation. I will say something about the framework that I used, and then how gender is represented in the policies that I kind of went through, and then I'll have some discussions and conclusions. Higher education in Ethiopia has been the focus of a lot of funding, a lot of policy making, a lot of reform in recent times. And just to tell you how higher education has been expanding in the country, in 2002, Ethiopia had, in 2002 we had only 2 public universities in the country, 2002. Fast forward 2017, we have 44 public universities. So it is a sector that is being given. Yeah, I mean, like it's expanding. It has its own problems, but this is a sector that is giving huge attention. More than 40% of the education budget for the country goes into the higher education sector. Okay, but unfortunately, there are numbers you cannot see. If you consider the gross, something is missing here, the gross enrollment ratio in the country, it stands still at 10%. So of the eligible age cohort that is supposed to attend higher education, only 10% are somehow having access. And of those, when it comes to the gender aspect of it, in 2015-2016, of all undergraduate enrollments, 34% are female students. So it's in 2016. So you can still see a considerable gender gap. Of course, compared to the 1970s, in 1970 we had only 7% of the student population, female students. But now we have 34.1%, still, compared even to sub-Saharan Africa, it's still lower. Let me come to the academic stuff. And can you see the colors? I hope so. So the darker shade is male academic staff members, and the lighter shade is female academic staff members. So according to the statistics, only 13% of Ethiopian academic staff are in the female or women category. So still a huge gap you can notice. In terms of qualification, even the higher you go, like bachelor's, master's, PhDs, the number of the gender disparity just increases. And when it comes to higher education leadership, in 2015 we had 37, 38 universities. In none of them we have female presidents or vice presidents. But in 2017 they kind of introduced some quota scheme, and I think they introduced 14 female vice presidents in 2017 to some of the 44 universities. This is per qualification. So higher you go, the number decreases. So the questions I ask is that, because I feel like I think that policy is one of the spaces where we can ask and interrogate what is going on. I intend to ask these questions to the national policy documents of the country. So I try to see what do actually all the policy documents that pertain to education state about gender and how it's represented in them, and how do they try to address this huge gender disparity, and what sort of measures are in place to ensure gender equity, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of these policy measures in terms of ensuring gender. Especially, I try to use critical feminist policy analysis. Here, I think we can. You also can help me out. I borrowed the framework from Beverly, McPhail, and Marshall, but I think I think we can, African feminisms and African feminist perspectives could also be used to kind of interrogate the higher education space as well. So maybe an input can be made. So the framework that I used, there are 5 categories. So I tried to see what the role of feminist scholarship and multiple identities of women are in the document. So I tried to see how does feminist scholarship inform the issue of gender disparity or representation, and if policies address the multiple identities of women in the policy documents, and do gender policies have any kind of, do they even achieve gender equity, or what is the result of those policy instruments? And I also try to see how structural inequalities are addressed in gender, and of course what are the silences in policy. I also try to see, since affirmative action is stated as one of the tools for addressing gender equity, what special treatment of women, if it causes any intended or unintended consequences, and what are, if there are any double standards regarding that. I try to see how context relevant the policy documents are by asking questions, and I try to see, in terms of power representation in policy documents, is there any visible representation of women in terms of drafting, designing the policy documents themselves, and are women organizations involved in policy design and implementation? Usually who has the power even to define the equity problem in the policy documents? So I try to see the constitution of the country, the education and the major documents regarding education policy, that's constitution, the Ethiopian education and training policy, and the higher education proclamations, the education sector development programs. These are like roadmaps, for 5-year roadmaps for implementing higher education. And specifically, the ministry has also something called the gender strategy for education and training. I try to analyze those documents in light of the questions that I put forward earlier. So yeah, what I found out is that in all the documents, the issue of, the kind of at times glaring gender disparity has been recognized, and all policies, all legal and policy documents seem to assert that situation should be remedied in some way or another, and they all recommend affirmative action measures. So this is the Constitution, after recognizing equal rights, calling for affirmative action. This is the education training policy of the country, trying to point out that gender mainstreaming in curricula is important, special attention to the participation of women in recruitment and training should be given, allocating gender responsive resources should be there, giving financial support to students should be there, women's participation in education leadership should be enhanced. The higher education proclamation of the country also, after affirming that the disparity should be addressed, it also kind of requires universities to increase the proportion of women in senior leadership positions. The education sector development plan especially sets targets. So by 2015, they wanted to have 40% of all the enrollments to be female students. But by 2015, the country had 32% of enrollment. So we can see that there is a bit of discrepancy. And they even set out to have 16 women in top leadership positions in universities by 2015. That did not work. If anything, in 2009 we had 3 women in top leadership positions, but by 2015 there was nobody around. Okay, so ESGP also advocates for affirmative action or preferential access, as I told you, and the gender equity strategy, it is informed by international treaties the country has been signatory to, and in 2013 they tried to state that gender equity in all aspects will be ensured. Okay, so they also set specific strategies. Now, let me just go to like what I made of after reading the documents, what I come up with. In terms of feminist scholarship and the representation of multiple identities of women, I can say that, of course, the issue is recognized in many of the documents, but in any place, nowhere, in no instances of the documents, you see feminist voices, feminist scholars being cited. You don't see the arguments, their works anywhere at all. It's just numbers after numbers from the ministry, and then just saying this should be done, this should be done, this should be done. So you don't see any feminist voices there. And also, like when you see the framing of the gender equity issue as well, it's like in order for the country to join the League of Middle-Income Countries by 2030, it's like a utilitarian, like it's an end to something, some bigger goal of poverty alleviation, or making the country a middle-income country or something like that. Just it's not framed as an end in itself somehow. And also, multiple identities of women, the discussion seems to be almost non-existent. It's like women are usually part of the disadvantaged group that the policy work presents them to be, and like there are different women from different socio-economic backgrounds, from different cultural backgrounds, from different geographic regions. And how these also identities intersect. Nuance seems to be missing in that regard. Different ethnicities, a huge difference between rural and urban women's experiences, that seems to be missing. And in terms of achieving gender equality, the question is just like, I would just see the implementation aspect. And yes, some remarkable gains seem to be made there, but still, especially with postgraduate studies, only 23.1% of Ethiopian women are involved that's a 2017 statistics, only 23.1%. And also, in terms of coming up with concrete strategies to in terms of especially science and technology fields, of course, across the board, female participation is lower. Like any discipline, bring in any discipline in Ethiopian context, always the participation of women and females and girls is lower. But especially, it's very dire in the science and fields related to science and technology, and policy documents seem to say nothing about that. Female in academic leadership, I've mentioned it earlier. We have 13% of the total academic staff females, and women are not that represented at all at top level managerial positions. And also, one of the problems is that when they measure equity, it's always in quantitative terms. Yeah, it's numbers. I think it kind of comes down to the neoliberal university that was being discussed earlier. It's about metrics, it's about rankings, it's about numbers. So the qualitative aspects, discussing those aspects seem to be missing. Qualitative aspects that usually don't that contribute to the absence of women in top leadership positions, they are missing. Okay. Affirmative action, well, affirmative action seems to be there, but a number of researchers have pointed out that affirmative action measures actually are not meeting the intended consequences that they intend. For example, there is students who get into the universities through affirmative action measures, they usually don't complete their studies. There is a lot of stigma and discrimination against female students that join different faculties and fields of study through affirmative action. And that has been discussed in research, but the policy documents simply just keep on advocating for it. How do you account for those, just letting the students into the university is not enough. What about the support they need while they are studying there, and how do you mitigate the negative consequences of affirmative action? The documents seem to say almost nothing. Context relevance, I have already discussed it earlier. Intersecting contextual factors, structural factors, historical, social, cultural, psychological factors seem to be not discussed in the policy documents. In terms of power analysis, how were the documents compiled, who was involved in them, who has participated, almost no transparent information is there. I even tried to contact the ministry, I didn't get any response. Another thing is in terms of still power relations, it seems that the policy is based on the deficiency model somehow. It's about, we use affirmative action, we use assertiveness trainings, we use quotas, and then there's the standardization of the male experience. It's just like somehow it seems to imply girls or women are deficient, so let's just push them up or empower them or something like that. So that seems to be, I think in a way they're trying to mitigate it, but they're also, the policymakers seem to uphold patriarchy at the same time and standardize it in a way. Okay, conclusions, I think I have already addressed them. So addressing gender disparities in higher education is stated as a major policy goal, but not in really concrete terms. It's very vague. Everywhere it's there, but how do you implement it? What is the responsibility of the different stakeholders, including the universities themselves? It's not stated there. Feminist concerns seem to be reflected and acknowledged, but in terms of how feminist thought and literature has been represented, it's also missing. Multiple identities, I've already said it. Also superficial framing in terms of affirmative action measures and their implications, and the ownership and involvement of women's organizations, and also, as I discussed, the mainly deficiency-based policy making and its implications seem to be overlooked. So yeah, I'm finished. Thank you very much. Kind of a very
Next up, we have Beverly Terri to speak to the topic of memory. The site of intersection is the site of every day.
I am 3 years old. Kreya! 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 I wait. Will my mother go or will she stay? Kreya! 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 She talks. Ka, 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 ka. I wait. She talks. Ka, 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 ka. I wait. The Olika boys are coming in the cart and the horse to sell herbs. My mother goes inside and she takes a plastic bag with money and she leans over and checks. And then she comes back And she goes out and she buys buhu. But while she's talking, I'm waiting for that chance that I can run. I wait. The gate has not opened. And I run as fast as I can up the hill. And then he catches me, takes my hand, and all I see are knees jutting as we walk down. I am not white. I am sand. I'm as white, but I am as white as the glaring sun. And I like to play Indian when we do Indians and cowboys, because I'm the Indian, and we can run, and we can talk in our little languages, and we can make a whole lot of food with the mud and the leaves and the everything. But I'm also 3 years old, where someone touches me where they are not supposed to. And it is then when this Native American ancestor comes to me, and I'm running, and Indians and cowboys and Indians, and he's watching me. Sometimes I think that is why I smoke. Because he sits under the avocado tree with a pipe, and he smokes, and he makes me a promise that he will follow me and he will look after me. And I trust you. I trust you. When Bernie makes this sculpture, for the ostrich eggs to be in here, you have to draw out all the essence and the innards of the inside. There we are, in an opaque glass. And on the floor she puts the debris, the pieces of our crockery that we ate food from, that we had breakfast from. And on the side, she puts the sand, a bow and arrow, to remind me to shoot straight. I'm not a coconut. I am not a white. I am sand. I am koi. But somewhere in between, I am taken by a white blood. Some people think I'm white, that I'm privileged, that I'm educated, that I'm classy, that I have an indeterminable accent that can only be French or Italian. Yet in France they think I'm Arab. And in Woodstock they talk to me like a Portuguese. They put me on a pedestal. But Al gives me a seed because the animals have been crafted on the seed. And she tells me to hang it on my neck so that I can listen to my own words, so that I can hear what I'm saying every day, every minute. My words need to echo forward and back to me so that I can also hear what I say. I am not white. You may see the exotic in me, like that French student who did that youth training in Paris. Perhaps you can hear the speech accent that I had to pass to get my drama degree from this university known as Rhodes. Still. But I am not white. My niece asks me, Auntie Beverly, who is she? And she's afraid. Because if this is my family, then this is her family. And I say to her, it is a child. I buy his artwork because it reminds me of the labyrinth, of the red soil, of everything I'm trying to find out about. But yet, there is a center. I know that, there is a center. So I cut my hair. Because she gives me this sculpture when her husband has had an affair and her back is broken. She tells me she likes the audacity of her breast hanging out. And then she dies of cancer. And I cut my hair in the spring of my knowledge for someone to make a wig. But Ed and I have the discussion about hair. The straight hair, the weaved hair, the GHD hair, the what, and we agree that hair is our business. It is women's business. It is nobody else's business what we do with our hair. But I am not white. I am not white. And when she leaves, she gives me this. It is actually H who divides the altar up into two. This is not mine. But H says, you know what? You need it, S needs it, share it. And I like it because it reminds me of the prayer that reverberates throughout my energy. And then my seer tells me, but it is not she who is speaking, it is the she of the she of the she of the she who is telling me that the cosmology of the world is not hierarchical, it is circular, and it starts from the soil, and it goes to the person, and to the animals, and to the plants, and to the sky, and it keeps going. But there's no sequence, because it is moving all the time, and she reminds me, we belong to the land does not belong to us, and I am not white. Even though they put me on a white pedestal, I am not white. Die groot vrou se plek in history, tits, bums and hair. Tits, bums and hair. To be a Khoisan, what do I have to prove? That something is unusual with my genitalia. It's the only way to know that I am Khoisan. Because that is the most significant part of being a Khoisan, isn't it? And so they tell me, Beverly, paint. Make our ancestors tall and colorful and let people find those images. It says, make bad, kick-ass art, who cares? So I wrap my head to hold my head high, because I am not white. I am not white. I am me. I am Beverly. I am San. I am Khoisan. I'm the scribe of legacy, the knowledge bearer of history, like all of us. I am here. Ta-da.
Wow, so after speaking to teacher, don't teach me nonsense. Yeah, such wonderful, diverse presentations that speak so interestingly to each other in a way. We ask where is the real teacher to do the real accounting here? And how do we speak to real practical solutions that speak and begin to outline a feminist possibility. And I'll open it up for discussions and questions as you've asked for input. Yes, is there anybody else? 1, 2, 3. We'll start with
A quick one for you, Addisalem. I'm wondering, you've talked about a national framework around gender mainstreaming. I'm wondering about, often in many African contexts, gender mainstreaming and also how the space for women and gender studies in universities also is shaped by global, or sort of, not global, but sort of like the question of power, for example, you're asking. So development, development as also like, then do gender mainstreaming. So there's a particular kind of language that enters the policy framework of the national, but it's informed by other relations and other kind of sort of flows of money and intellect that shape that structure. So I'm wondering about that. But if I had 2 questions also for you. I wonder about the purchase of such a long single history of patriarchy, or what it does, because even the example you gave of marriage, in looking at codifications of marriage law, for example, across different African contexts, even the language shift from wife of to wife to, and the implication it has in terms of making the wife subject the junior to the husband subject, no matter what equal laws then follow. Those negotiations also happen in very contested ways. So the codes in sort of codifying customary law or other shapes of law often happen in the case where the assumption is that the person I have children with is the person I'm married to and for life, where people's lives don't fit neatly into that. So then the law is coded to fit people better, but it's also in a context where marriage is never even. It's not historically even, so people may not have chosen it or understood a marital career to be singular, or understood who I sleep with is also who I'm married to, is also who I have children with. So those contestations, when we see the law, it looks like patriarchy in this way, but people's lives haven't matched up to the desire of the law itself. So the singularity of the law itself in the capital L, if we place it as the kind of large structure, then we miss all the other ways, and the only ways we see other relations that are sexual or kinship is as extra to the power of that capital P, capital L. So I was thinking about that, and then also about the taxonomy of feminism. So I wonder what purchase that also has to say liberal or African, etc. And I was thinking of Chela Sandoval's framing of differential. So we can think about different strategies we use, and they may have a name within a taxonomy, but we don't do taxonomy because it's precisely within the frame of taxonomy that patriarchal law resides. Yeah.
I'm so sorry I arrived late, so I didn't hear, is it Efua? I didn't hear your whole talk, but I was very interested in what I did hear, and you posed a question about what tools do we use to dismantle, the patriarchy, the neoliberalism in higher education. And I don't know if I missed a whole lot before then. But it occurred to me, and I guess it's inspired by this space, which lets us be intuitive rather than formulaic and bureaucratic. And if we think of universities where, if we think of the ways universities are trying to increase access. I mean, I even hear that word and it makes me go a little bit cold. Increase access. Provide academic support. There are these terms that are added on over time in order to try and adjust to different ideological realities. And so, I mean, as a teacher myself in an academic support program, which is the extended studies, I just find that I constantly not break the rules, but work according to an intuitive response to the students that I teach, which is free labor, I work double, time because I care and because students know that I care, and so the way that I approach students is. It is academically rigorous when I have to teach a course, but in my relations with them, it defies the ways that we usually relate to in academic spaces. And I don't think I'm dismantling anything, but I think I am generating something in the students that I have contact with. And I'm also not saying that to be feminist is to be nurturing and caring. I think there are different ways to be feminist, but I think what I'm getting from this conference and from spaces like this is that if we attend to our intuitive, progressive way of wanting to be a healing force in the world, that we can find ways that are just counter to what the discourse is. And I don't know if that's very helpful, but I just thought I wanted to say that. And then Addisalem, thanks for your work and for the way that you're critiquing what is happening and why it's happening. Interestingly, I did my master's 10 years ago on gender in our university, and was also looking at policies and looking at numbers and feeling quite frustrated with, so what then? You know, where do we go with that? And one of the authors then that really helped me to, and she keeps coming back to me, is Shireen Hassim. And she wrote things like No Shortcuts to Power. So she was looking at the feminist project at the time of changing into a democratic country. So she was looking at, you know, the women who marched, the women who brought the Women's Charter. How did they fit into the new government? And the debate then was representation. Women must be representative, and we were lucky, in inverted commas, because we did have a quota system. We still do have a quota system, so we do have women in power, but without an actual transformational agenda. Having those women in powerful positions just means that those women have to be like men. So it doesn't actually fix anything at all. And policies that domesticate a radical transformation and co-opt these ideas will only ever perpetuate an inequality thing. So I just thought I'd say that. Thanks.
I think there's a chance to respond to that.
If I may, Dina, can I repeat back the question, just so that I know that I understood it, the two questions. So the first one, you first, I think there was an A and a B part. The A part was the purpose of mapping out a long history, and then within that mapping out of a long history, I mentioned marriage, and you were saying that if I'm only focusing on the single example of marriage, I'm missing out the nuance of the permutation, the multiple permutations of how women move around. No. Yes.
I was giving it as one. I was thinking this long single history of patriarchy.
Yeah.
And the marriage example was one way of saying that. So we could look at it through this example, but if we look at it differently, it's not. The capital P is also much more unstable.
Okay. Yeah, I think that I understand it. So, I guess in my understanding, I'm so firmly wedded to use marriage. I'm firmly wedded to the idea that a lot of the problems that we experience are because of a toxic masculine reading of patriarchy. And one of the ways in which I think toxic masculinity holds people down, women particularly down, is through marriage. There's so many different. So this essentially, what we were trying to do in the paper is to problematize patriarchy, because we use the word patriarchy so often in these circles. And so what we wanted to do was actually track. We're not historians. I did an undergraduate in history, but it's not, it's not like my badge of honor is not a historian. But what we're trying to do is to situate patriarchy as the single most salient practice through all the repressive major systems that we've had on the continent. We've had slavery, we've had colonialism, we have post-independence states, neo-coloniality, neoliberalism, capitalism. The only thing for me that I think, or for us, is this carryover of a patriarchal practice that biases male prowess and male success as the top. And so that's why we thought that perhaps maybe if we indicated and showed very clearly that patriarchy has existed way before colonialism, way before slavery in effect as well, that somehow it would give us a better understanding of what we need to target in addressing transformational decoloniality. But it's not enough to just talk about giving people more freedoms, or giving people more access to different spaces, or giving people higher salary incomes, or because if we don't understand the way in which we're ontologically centuries and centuries of thinking in a way that privies male dominance is the only way forward, then it's a little bit futile, because no matter how we try and reinvent ourselves, we're still going to be carrying the toolkit of patriarchy. And when we're trying to think creatively of how we can transform HLIs, but we are still using patriarchy as we're still so steeped in patriarchal practices that it's very difficult for us to try and reinvent anew when we are still carrying the patriarchy. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, and if it doesn't, I can, maybe afterwards we can elaborate and we can go back and forth. I'm not sure if I was so clear. And then the second part about what's the purpose of the usefulness of the taxonomy of feminisms. Yeah, I mean, the world of taxonomy is the world of organizing and categorizing things, which is very much a part of the patriarchal practice. And so, how it's because that's what is there, you know, this liberal feminism, people are writing about liberal feminism, radical feminism, African feminisms, and so if we just do away with those, if we do away with the categories, it's exactly what my challenge is that, okay, so we do away with, they've served their purposes, patriarchal thinking has served its purpose to undo the status quo, but now it's exactly what you're saying, so fine, let's do away with the taxonomy of feminisms, and then what are we left with? And something that is, so I'm going with the comment about intuitively. So right now, I mean, intuitively, my whole life has basically been one long journey of exploring my intuition. So intuitively, right now, I feel like I want to share this book that I recently read, by Richard Powers, and it's called The Overstory. I don't know if anybody has read it or has heard about it. And it is kind of whereas Beverly was up sharing her work, it reminded me of just the different ways in which, particularly the part where you said something about how it's hierarchical, the knowledge is, you know, it's in the land and it goes to the tree and there's no beginning, there's no end. So the Overstory is basically an ode to trees and an ode to the ecology of systems, and that it's all cyclical, that there isn't a beginning, there isn't an end, and trees really give us so much of a starting base of how we can reimagine the world anew, which is anyway, that's also a bit of a tangent. So for example, there's a tree that essentially creates its own soil on its branches. So we imagine that trees have, the soil is on the ground and the roots go down. But this tree, and I forget what it's called, is such a large tree that when the debris falls down on the branches that are in the second tier, it starts disintegrating, which is what soil is. It's just fragmented leaves and nature's debris. It creates soil on the branches, and then the upper layer branches then reach down to that bedrock of soil that is already on the branches to grow new plants anew. I mean, trees are one of the most remarkable organisms that we have at our disposal, and perhaps maybe if we also look at the more ecological foundations, maybe that is a way in which we can reimagine the world anew, that we can move away from these taxonomies of feminisms. Maybe feminism isn't actually the one that we can use to dismantle patriarchy. Maybe it's trees. Maybe trees will be what we need to do. We understand how trees give us life. Oh man, trees are just so amazing. And one last thing about trees, and then I promise I will promise is that and it's maybe useful for us, is that, and the silences, is that sometimes you have a seed that disappears entirely from our earth for thousands of years, and the seed is just germinating just below the earth's surface, and then when it is the right time, the right climate, the right temperature, out pops the little seedling. But thousands of years, it disappears from people's knowledge, disappears, there's no trace record of it. And then suddenly it pops anew, thousands of years later. So I really do think, I believe in trees.
Thank you. Sorry. I believe in trees too. Okay, coming to the questions that were raised on my presentation. I think two of the issues reflected are somehow kind of related because when it comes to the external pressures, I think that's what you are referring to, about like pushing the agenda of establishing gender studies, and many of the universities even have like special directorates for promoting gender equity or equality or whatever. But as the second person spoke, it was like, it's usually as a kind of personal reflection, I used to teach in an Ethiopian university as well, and I was involved in academic administration as well. And the thing is, there seems to be a lack of commitment actually. Really, like in terms of doing the actual work of discussing and debating the matter and coming up with all sorts of gender equity related, the commitment is not there. The thing is, donors have a lot of influence on that. Like they say, okay, if you want to get this money, then you have to have these many women like department heads or deans, or you need to train these many like female students to do this. It's just because there are like many of the universities, university officials. It's because they are they want the money, they want the aid, they want the recognition, they want to be considered as champions of gender equity. That they just try to say, okay. So let's do this, let's give this training to these students, or let's put these many university lecturers into these places. And but when actually like questions, real questions of like, yeah, okay, you have assigned me as a gender office director, I want to ask this question, I want to do this, I want to work with these people, the doors are closed. Yeah, so it's just as you're saying, there's no transformational agenda. It's just there's something that pushes university leaders, and then yeah, it's just lip service. From my own experience and from my talking to colleagues, of course, like the policies say this and that, but the actual commitment to transform the university space in terms of creating more equitable gender spaces, it's missing in Ethiopian higher education. And yeah, it's just, that's what I and a lot needs to be done there, I guess.
I'll take one last round. Three questions. Do you still want to ask a question? Okay. Is there a hand up? Okay, 3 questions. We'll start there, then it's done.
Yeah, Efua, it is again to you. You've extended the boundaries of time to go beyond colonialism and to establish patriarchy. I can't help feeling that would be a very powerful basis for a new epistemology. But you also mentioned, it seemed in passing, matriarchy, but you didn't expand on matriarchy. So there is a very big literature on matriarchy, but there's also a debate among feminists on that. And I wondered if you could say something about a matriarchal society. Because if you want to talk about patriarchy, we do need to talk about a matriarchal society not as something of the future alone, but something on which civilizations were founded upon. And so there seems to be a suppression of that historical phase of matriarchy. And I do know that there is a very extensive literature, both within the marginalized West and in the South, which is not coming into universities as knowledge. And so I am very fascinated with that topic of the matriarchal society, particularly things like the transference of property rights, which is a legal thing, matrilineal societies where property has passed down from mothers to daughters and their sisters. It is an absolute fact that there are such societies still existing. And so the question is why? So there must be a basis for saying that women must have also contributed economically for that property right to exist.
Thank you. I want to start with a question for Bear, because that was, I can't even begin to say thank you, because I find the form of the seminar, a lot of the ways in which we're expected to speak to each other to be incredibly violent. So it was phenomenal, and I want you to speak about that and the thought process around just however you're going to frame it. But I'd like to hear some of that because it was exciting and it did stuff, and you managed to connect the affective to the epistemological and to and it was just the room changed. So it was. So I'd like to hear some of that. Then Efua. So one of the things that anthropology does best is specificity and cultural relativism, which is entirely absent in the talk. And although there's power in a geopolitical framing, it also requires specificity. And if you're going to do an anthropology of a particular sort, then you need the comparative aspect. So my question is, how do you know? How do you know which are the sources you're using? Which Africa are you speaking to? Because you're constituting an Africa in the way in which you frame the single story. So how do you know? And I think it would be valuable to focus, if you're going to do something that intends to cross boundaries spatially, but also politically and transhistorically, because this is a very retrospective kind of analysis. There's something teleological about it. If you're doing that, it might be useful to take a few specific spaces and then bring them into conversation with each other. To say, we've seen this in, this is how patriarchy in the pre-colonial moment operated in Maggott. This is how it's operated in Sudan. This is how, and to bring them together and to show the connections between these patriarchies. Because it's not patriarchy. There are patriarchies and their masculinities and their femininities. And then what can we see in this, in the way in which Africa is sort of being lumped into one huge geographical space. And colonialism there were different forms of colonialism. So which colonialism? British colonialism, French colonialism, Portuguese colonialism. The ways in which femininities and masculinities were reframed, sustained, maintained, etc., all the ways in which history works its way out within social spaces. There were differences. So which colonialism again? Because there is something productive about these sort of geopolitical framings, but at the same time, you don't want to retell the story we've been fed, because there's, this is the story we've been fed, and if you're wanting to do that work, it requires something slower. But, okay, that's the pretty. I think you need to write the paper on the seedling. Like start from the tree, because that was, and the way you light up, it is like magic. And it is really like magic. Write that paper and start there. That's the steamy ground, and to take us into the new space.
Last question.
My question is very short, just one thing. Because I think I'm also excited. I'm just wondering if the presentation was part of your paper, and how are you going about writing about it, if you are, because I know that last year you did present on some the topics that you touched on, Khoisan and everything.
Alright. Yeah. Is that good? Okay, thank you. I wanted to, because it's an African Feminism Conference, and I think that Charlene, we've all been talking about how we can be creative in our presentations. And so I thought to myself, from the time I was 3 years old, I've been teaching. At the bath, my mother used to put things there, and I used to write in the back of the door. But it was all in other languages, and so I kind of had all these people around me. And I think the experience here is just to bring my lived experience into this formal place, and bring those truths that my mother and other people are telling me, and that ancestors, when they come and they say, no babe, it's not like that, then I must bring it, I must talk about some of those things. So when I tried to write the paper, I couldn't find the words to write the paper. So then I was looking around me, and I thought, God, my whole room is like an altar. It's like all these things. And so I have my own installation, like we all have, my own gallery. So I call it the spiritual collection of my invisible economy. It's something that you see and you don't see, and I just wanted to play with the ideas of what I have, like a museum. Because we always say we don't want our house to look like a museum, we're quiet, whatever, but we do have those artifacts and bodies, and what they mean to us, and what children think about it, Like my nephew, when I took him to an art gallery, and I was carrying him, and we were going like, and then he was going, and then at some point he said, Auntie Beverly, what are we looking for? So that's kind of made me remind me of when you're a child. It's different. You're walking and you just see knees and bumps and tits. You look up and you just see tits. Kind of just kind of made me think, go back into my memory. And so I thought I want to go back into the memory. And Motsemi's work inspired me because what happened there was that Ntabi's saying, and I spoke to you yesterday, it's like other people were writing about the truth and reconciliation, but I couldn't relate to it, and the white people, I don't want to be racist, but anyway, they're quick to publish, and we take 30 years to publish, like my experience of detention, I'm only recovering now. It was 9 months of detention. So it's these things that are helping me. And so, and what I'm trying to do is work with academia, with the research, with the education. And I kind of think that I'm becoming elder, and the person who's dying is becoming ancestor. And so there's a whole kind of tradition and wave that I have to be conscious of. And that's really what I'm doing, I'm just being conscious and thinking, okay, if you know, we worked in administration and your paper allowed me to see through my life in Addisalem. You see, because I was part of this structure, you know, where they said, Bev, no one is going to listen to you unless you wear a suit. You know, if I came in like this, then the one, you know, one Afrikaner guy called me side B. He said, Bev, you've got very important things to say, but if you don't wear a suit, no one will listen to you. So I got my chumala, we got a whole suit, we made a whole thing, and we came in and we got the whole power presentation to see whether this is going to work. And suddenly everybody listens. And we were like blown away, like, what do you do now? Do you start dressing in suits to get heard? Or do you carry on being a gypsy as they're calling you? Or do you play and then you decide, okay guys, listen, we suit today with this. And it became like a whole feminist strategy of how you dress and perform, you know. So I wanted to just share that kind of thinking, you know. And some of the things I didn't speak about, like you spoke about the art in trees. So there by the glass, that is what I just found on the floor. And every time I look at it, I see images. And I'm like, nature makes art. You know, so I thought, how baby, why are you making art? You just need to walk around and say, this is tree eucalyptus. And just exhibit, you know, the art around me. And then figure out how I'm going to make my own stuff, you know. And filling the mantelpiece with our stuff. You know, personal stuff, and that was it. And the two glasses are like, you know, we all search for love, but we all think of it as two people. And for me, it's like twice and thrice, you know, like the first time she married me, the second time I married myself, the third time he married me. So I've actually been like, so what I say is like this one here that's giving me the third ring, it's a package deal guy. We got like, and you know, when you marry me now, you're marrying a clan. You know, and then because I'm not making apologies, I had the most beautiful relationship with a woman, and now you want me cool. You know, we do this thing, but that's the package. So you have to work out how that works. So it's new truths that I'm trying to, and my influence, as you know, as I'm preparing to be elder, my influence is the children, because what we remember is what our grandmothers tell us. And that's why my grandmother's brooch is the only one I have, anything of her. Because what she told me is what is now coming back, you know. And so I don't want to talk. I don't want to share my colonial education, because I'm very good at that. I'm like one of the best colonized minds. So when the children tell me this, I can now ask them the questions, because my thinking is like the decolonization must start at 3, because that's where my change. You know, I didn't understand what was going on, but there were all these ancestors and things happening around me in my games, and I'm thinking, that's the moment. The stories you start to share. And so that when the children come here to Rhodes University, I'm very excited. It's in like 20, 30, 40 years' time. They come here already prepared. They're like, I know Fannin. You got anything else? My grandma told me that. It's going to be different, you see? They're going to say, so it's kind of preparing them for this life from 3, not from 17. You know, for me it was 17, we arrive at Rhodes and you're the first person, you're like, and I say that thing about I'm not white because I can't see myself. Remember, I come from a community, I can't see myself. We don't have a lot of mirrors there. So when I came here and people were thinking I'm white, I'm like, what's white about me, guys? I don't even speak like these people. No, how? She's white, she's white, she's white. And then my daughter said to me, Mommy, but you are white. And I like looked at the mirror and thought, yo, I'm white. She was 10 years old. I was 34. Like, you know, it took me that long time to say, you know, you do have that thing about whiteness about you. So it's just sharing that fun, you know, and I think that, and I kind of thought, well, let me first do it, and then I can write about it. So that's
Quick, just a one sentence. matriarchy, matrilineal, certainly. I think what is clear is that, obviously, this was the first draft of the paper. I think I also want to highlight that patriarchy as a status quo, as the fallback mechanism. So of course there's matrilineal systems, there's matriarchies, at least one as a status quo, that the only one that exists as a status quo that I know of is the Mosuo of Southwest China, as a status quo, that everything is run through the matriarchal lens. But we have certainly matrilineal systems like the Queen Mothers in West Africa. And certainly in East Africa there's also marriage lines that are same-sex marriages that happen, and all kinds of different permutations. But I think what I would like to say about patriarchy is that it's the status quo, and that we definitely don't have matriarchy as the status quo. And the question about the anthropology is like the stick of being really specific of where you mean. Yes, I take that on board, and I think what we should definitely do for this paper, considering the title is HLIs in South Africa, is that perhaps we should focus on the presentation of slavery and colonialism in South Africa, and then in another paper tackle patriarchy on the continent, and then of course be sensitive to Dutch colonialism, to French, to German, to British, to all the different other colonialisms that happen on the continent.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.